Welcome to another edition of Teach the Geek interviews. My name is Neil Thompson. I'm the founder of Teach the Geek. It's an online platform for science and engineering professionals. You can learn more about it at teachthegeek.com. Again, that is teachthegeek.com. Today, my guest is Dr. Meagan Pollock. She's the founder of Engineer Inclusion, using engineering thinking, process improvement, and research-based strategies to help companies reach their business goals. She started off as an engineer, so I'm really interested to learn more about her transition from engineer to consultant. And she's also a speaker, and I'm curious to find out what she speaks on. So welcome to Teach the Geek interviews, Meagan.
Thanks, Neil. Glad to be here.
So from the bit of research I did on you, I saw that you got a degree in computer science. Where did the interest in computer science come from?
I started programming when I was in eighth grade. We had, and I'm from a really small rural town in Southeast Texas. And in hindsight, that's pretty remarkable that we had a teacher who was teaching us programming. It also helps that my dad and my granddad are both computer scientists. And so I had that influence. And then that teacher, when we moved to the high school, she came with us. And so I ended up having, 5 years of programming. And I thought, hey, this seems like a pretty good direction for me. And so that's how I got into computer science.
But you didn't stop there. You then got a master's in electrical engineering. What was the motivation to get that degree?
I was in a really special, unique program funded by Texas Instruments. And so, as many of your listeners might know, that women are significantly underrepresented in most engineering disciplines. And so TI thought, hey, let's go to a women's college because there's a lot of women there and pay for their undergrad. And then we'll pay for them to get a master's in electrical engineering from Texas Tech and give them internships along the way. And so that was the route that I took. I was in this Women in Engineering program funded by TI in a partnership with Texas Women's University and Texas Tech. And so that was my journey there.
But then you didn't even stop there. Then you got a PhD in engineering education. What made you decide to go for the PhD?
Well, after my master's, I worked in industry. I worked for the digital light processing group within Texas Instruments. So we worked with little tiny, microscopic mirrors that if you've ever been to digital cinema, there's a good chance it's a DLP projector. The technology is also in your cars and our, lots of different devices, medical devices as well. And while I was working for TI, I was volunteering at a local school, talking to kids and counselors about how cool engineering is and how they should consider an opportunity to go into engineering. And I, like many people back in early 2009, I got hit in the big reduction in force in the tech industry. And I thought, hey, I've always wanted a PhD. I wanted a PhD since I was in kindergarten. And I thought, hey, now's the time. And somebody had just introduced me to the engineering education program at Purdue University. And so I applied within a couple of days of getting hit in the riff. And I moved up there like 2 months later and started my doctorate. And I started my PhD really with the desire to change the culture of engineering. Like many marginalized and traditionally excluded people within, a field that has a dominant culture, I experienced some of the shadow side of that, and I wanted to change the culture of engineering. And so I worked on my doctorate, finished that in 2014. And so since 2009, I've been teaching, speaking, and writing about how to improve equity and inclusion and diversity and belonging within STEM pathways, both in education and in the workforce.
You mentioned earlier that when you were working, you noticed that women were underrepresented in engineering. What would it mean for women to be represented?
Well, underrepresented in the sense that, depending on the discipline, there's anywhere from, 10 to 15% of the people working in industry are women. And it's even, when we look at and we disaggregate by race, people of color are significantly underrepresented, or specifically Black and Hispanic people are significantly underrepresented within engineering. What it would mean to be fully represented would mean parity, right? So that the same number of women in the world is represented as the same number of, percentage wise of women in the workforce. So that's, parity is part of the goal, but really, in order for us to reach parity, we must change the culture of these environments. Because until we change the culture, the people who've been traditionally marginalized and excluded don't stay, right? And to be quite honest, I'm one of those statistics, right? I did not stay in engineering because I found that I could explore other avenues and cultures and organizational climates where I felt like I could be more of myself and choose to belong. And so, yes, parity is part of the goal to be equitably representative. But until we change the culture and the climate, we're still going to be facing these issues and these challenges. And that's what I get to do with organizations, is help them to begin to address the culture and climate.
Got it. I mentioned inclusion in the intro. At some point, obviously at some point you started it. When you first started engineer inclusion, what was the goal for it? And then is the goal the same now?
Yeah, it is. So, one of the things that I have the opportunity to do is to use my engineering background, to use my programming background that's very logical, process oriented, to be able to look at things systemically and to look at all of the different components. I use the same kinds of skills to do root cause analyses. And so bringing in all of that skill set and training of how I was taught to think and to operate, I bring that into the work that I do with organizations. And so the original mission of engineer inclusion remains the same: to intentionally and systematically help people and organizations intentionally engineer equity and inclusion and structural belonging for people who've been traditionally excluded and marginalized in those populations.
What does structural belonging mean?
So structural belonging to me is different than like a forced belonging. So forced belonging is like, it's like saying, hey, here we are. This is our organization. We're a circle. Come on in, make yourself belong, right? So forced belonging is like square peg, round hole. I'm going to fit no matter what. But in the process of me trying to be determined and fit in and belong, I end up losing part of myself, right? If you sort of shave off the edges of a circle to fit into that, or the square peg into the round hole, you shave off part of yourself to fit into that. That's like a forced belonging. And many people are determined to belong. They're determined to fit in. They're going to do what it takes. And what often happens is there is an adaptation, an assimilation, where we unconsciously adapt to these environments because it's a survival tactic, right? It's an effort to survive. And so we adapt and change to fit into the environment that we've been placed in. Whereas structural belonging is changing the culture so that people don't have to do that, right? So that people can show up as their authentic selves. They can show up and they are a square peg and they can find a square hole, right? They don't have to change part of themselves. They don't have to force themselves to adapt and assimilate in a function of survival in order to belong in those spaces. And so that's structural belonging. It's saying, instead of here's the circle, come on and fit in, it's saying, hey, how do we change the culture and climate of our organization so that everybody gets to show up, be their true authentic selves? And when you do that, when we are able to show up as our authentic selves and we don't have this shadow job of trying to perform in a culture that's not normal to our own. And so often, again, this is happening unconsciously, right? Like for me as a woman in engineering, I did not realize the extent to which I was performing this sort of role to fit in with this super male dominant, very masculine environment until I left. And I was like, wow, I didn't realize all the ways in which I was conforming to this, the ways that I had taken on other ways of knowing and doing and being as a sort of trying in an effort to fit in, right? And so when we don't have all of our cognitive load that's forced, right, often unconsciously to sort of perform in these kinds of ways, we get all that bandwidth to actually function and perform our jobs. So we do better. We're more creative. We have better culture and climate when we can all show up and we're not just trying to fit a specific mold.
So if you're somebody that's working at a company, how can you tell the difference between whether the company has structural belonging or it's a culture that you just don't like?
So I think it's, when I talk with people, particularly people who've been traditionally marginalized and excluded in the field, it takes a lot of self-awareness to recognize the degree to which they are surviving in a space or whether they are thriving, right? And so, because we're so focused on surviving in a space, we're trying to adapt and to find ways of fitting in. Um, we sort of become a chameleon, right? We adapt the sort of what our environment looks like. And so if you are a person who's in a culture and climate that you just don't like, it could mean that there is definitely not structural belonging, right? So I would encourage anyone to first think of, like, first, am I safe, right? Am I taking care of myself? Am I okay? Is this a good environment for me? Two, if you are recognizing that, the part of the culture that you don't like is just that everybody goes to happy hours and watches football games, maybe you can offer, hey, can we do something else? Can we have a different kind of activity? And say it would be important for me to sort of share my ways of knowing and doing, my interests and cultures, and share those with the team so that we're not just dominated on those two things. And hopefully they'd be open to that. If they're not, then there's something to really think about, like, how can you exercise your influence? How can you talk to the leadership around you? How can you build some advocacy for people? But really, what I encourage are all of us as contributors, as leaders, as managers, whatever level of influence that we have, how are we looking at the environment around us? How are we using global listening skills and really looking at what are the dominant norms in our team, in our group, in our organization, and how am I paying attention to, and in what ways am I listening to other ways of knowing and doing and inviting those into the space? So the onus isn't just on the people who've been marginalized to fix this, right? It's on all of us to begin to look at and say, how can we exercise a more inclusive environment here by bringing in different ways of knowing and doing. But again, I always advise people who are maybe dealing with different kinds of culture conflicts. It's really important that you take care of yourself, that you make sure that you're safe. And while we want people to stay in the industry, there are certainly some teams that aren't a good fit. If you're in a large organization, maybe there's another team that you can move to that would be a better fit. Doesn't mean you need to leave the organization. But sometimes, you have to take care of yourself. You don't have to prove to the entire world that, women and people of color are gonna fit no matter what. We don't have to be martyrs. We can take care of ourselves in that process.
Absolutely. So, with the work that you do with organization and with engineer inclusion, how do you know that what you're doing is actually working?
That's a great question. When I get the chance, I like to do some assessment work around the work that I get to do. And usually that's best measured over long-term engagement. So if I have an opportunity to have a long-term engagement with a client, I'll do a pre and post test so I can measure growth. And what I'm looking for are changes in knowledge, attitudes, behaviors, and self-efficacy. So I want to know, do people learn something? Are people's beliefs about things shifting? Most importantly, are they doing things differently? And then finally, self-efficacy, that's the belief that you can accomplish a task. So not only do I want to know, did they learn something? Do they change the way they think? Do they change that way that they behave? But do they have confidence to begin to lead and initiate change? And so when I get a chance, I like to measure those different constructs. A lot of times, though, unfortunately, when I'm hired to come in and do a keynote or something, I'm not able to measure anything off of that, right? But we know to create sustained change that it has to be over a period of time. And so those are my favorite engagements when I get to work with clients over a duration of time. Another way that we can begin to look at and measure change is when I have an opportunity to do a sort of collective impact approach with clients. And what that means is that, when an organization is trying to really understand their culture, what often happens is they do surveys, right? And I don't know if you or your listeners have ever done like a survey of like, how do you feel in this environment, right? And a lot of times those surveys, they're not telling enough, right? They don't tell us enough about people's true experiences, and they generally do not tell us what to do about it. And what often happens is people feel discouraged because they're like, not another survey, right? Like, I live this stuff every day. I don't want to relive my trauma in order to answer your survey about how I feel in an environment that has affected me so deeply, right? So I don't advocate for those. I advocate for a collective impact approach where we bring people together and we just say, hey, what do we need to do differently? So we do like a SOAR analysis: strengths, opportunities, aspirations, and results. So we're thinking about how do we move forward? We're bringing people together to make that plan together. So, I mean, I don't want to come in and give you a plan, right? I want to come in and work with your people to create a plan that's going to address your needs. And so that is one way that we can do that. And when we create this, basically it's like a strategic planning process, is we end up with, in the end of that analysis, objectives and key results, which is very common in tech, people call it different things, but objectives, key results, or otherwise known as OKRs. When we create these objectives and key results, these OKRs, then we can measure that, right? We can measure, are we doing the things that we're saying that we're going to do? Are we having the impact that we want to have? But so often, measuring impact specifically around people's sense of belonging. Like, I was with a client a few months ago and they had on the screen 76% of people feel like they belong, and they were celebrating that. And I'm like, I'm worried about the 24%, right? Like, what's happening to those other, people, and how are we paying attention to their needs? Like, if a quarter of your people don't feel like they belong, this isn't something to celebrate, right? How are we addressing their needs, and asking them to the table and giving them voice? They already have voice. How are we giving space to their voice so that we can understand and address their concerns? So measuring this is really hard, but there are ways that we can do it.
Interesting. So the 76% wasn't a good enough number. So what would an appropriate number be for the company to celebrate?
I mean, if this number 76 was an increase from a previous test, then that is something we're celebrating. I don't know what their previous numbers were, but I still think that, if you're one of the people, if you're one of the 24% that does not feel like they belong, and you're at this huge global event that's saying, "Yay, we celebrate 76%," and you're the 1 in 4, I'd be looking around saying like, what about my experience, right? What are we doing to help the rest of us who are marginalized and excluded here? So I mean, sure, we want everyone to feel like they belong. So I feel like, if you're reaching 100, then that's great, right? And that's certainly idealistic, but I think that it's hard to celebrate any number when somebody still feels excluded, right?
Wow. Yeah, I go 100 is hard. Even paternity tests aren't 100%.
I just think we have to be wary about any kind of number that we're showcasing, because does that highlight, what is it really highlighting, right? And what is it doing to the people for whom it does not describe? If my goal is to be an inclusive leader, if my goal is to create an inclusive environment, I think we can create metrics that help us understand this. But I think that we need to be really thoughtful to the ways in which we celebrate, so that it's not performative, right? So that it's truly saying, hey, another way of doing it is saying, we did this survey, we found that 76% of people feel like they belong, and we're still working really hard to figure out how do we help the other 24% feel like they belong, right? There's two different ways of approaching that. You can still have the data, but it's just the way that you describe the data, so that those people still feel seen and heard, and confident that you're going to continue to do something to address their needs.
All right. So you got the 76% that feel that belong, but we're still working on the other 24%. But in the interim, we can still have cake.
I didn't know that it's worth having cake over.
No, no cake. Okay. All right.
I'll
So
have cake for birthdays.
all right. Got you. When I first started this whole podcast, the goal of it was to help people and becoming more comfortable and just giving presentations in front of people. And I should rephrase that, not just people, but people that come from the more technical fields, since I think a lot of us, myself included, struggled with it. But in your instance, is giving presentations in front of people something you've always been good at? And if not, what did you do to get better at it?
So it is not something I've always been good at because, like anything, I practice. Now, what's maybe different about my journey is I started really early. So when I was in junior high, so sixth, seventh, and eighth grade, I started competing in like public speaking things. And so I was learning as early as then. And then I continued that through high school and like won some scholarships for like public speaking kinds of things. So I began practicing really early. I also, had some opportunities to be, leader, and that helped me sort of gain confidence talking in front of groups really early on in life. So it's not a function of always being good at it, right? I practiced, I learn, and I get better over time. Um, so anybody who is interested in kind of learning to public speak, I think that, you're not alone if you're scared. Like it's the whatever, I think it's the number one fear and on the globe is public speaking. So you're certainly not alone. But just like you learn to do anything, you learn to cook, you learn to ride a bicycle, you learn to public speak. And one of the things that is really important to remember is that if you're experiencing a physiological reaction like butterflies, or you are sweating, or you're having some kind of reaction, just because you're having that physiological reaction doesn't mean that you're not good at public speaking. And so this is one of the sources of self-efficacy, these physiological responses. And that's something I had to deal with. So like I have like my body temperature just runs kind of hot. And so when I first started public speaking and teaching, I was like always sweating, right? And I thought, oh my gosh, maybe I can't be a public speaker because I'm just always sweating. And then one day, like I was sweating so much that like somebody handed me like a wad of tissues. And so I was dabbing my face. And then I went in the restroom and I had tissue all over my face. I was like, oh my God, what am I going to do? So now I have a whole collection of like handkerchiefs, right? So I just never leave home with that one. I always have them in my pocket so I don't ever have like tissue hanging off of my face. And so it's learning to recognize just because I'm experiencing nerves, just because I'm experiencing sweatiness, just because I'm experiencing whatever these things are, doesn't mean I can't do something. For me, it's more about the message. It's more about, I think that one of my strengths is taking research and making it very actionable, making it make sense. And so I love to stand on the shoulders of giants and take all of the amazing research that has been done and then teach people. So to me, that's more important to me is the message than a spotlight, right? And so for anybody that's interested in public speaking or just standing up and speaking at a meeting, right, at work, right, think about the message. It's not about the spotlight. Think about what is it that you want to communicate. And I think that people will be able to build some skill set. But nerves are normal, and just because you're experiencing them again doesn't mean you can't do the task.
Yeah, I'm a big believer in, if you aren't nervous or before giving a presentation, it's likely because you don't care so much about it. So if you're in the audience listening to Meagan speak and you see her sweating profusely, it's because she cares a lot about the message.
Or because I was out working in the yard this morning. Either way, but like
When it comes to the presentations that you give, do you have a process for putting them together? And if so, what is it?
so everybody does things differently. If I'm preparing a workshop, right? What I use is I use a process that's in the book called Understanding by Design by Wiggins and McTighe. It's sort of like my Bible of any kind of curricular design. And I use the same thing when I'm writing a speech. And it starts with, what do I want people to know? How will I know they know it? And then what are the interventions that connect those two? And so it's sort of backwards design. So I start with that a lot of times when I'm writing just a speech. Then I think about what are the key points, and then so I start with sort of 3 key points, and then I step back. What are the anecdotes, the stories that are going to highlight that? What are some of the most compelling things, phrases things that I want to highlight? And again, everybody's different in this. Like when I did my TED talk back in October of a year ago, some people, like, they had written their TED talk before they even applied, right? And I was like, I'm gonna write it the weekend before, and even the process of writing a speech, because typically when I give a keynote, I've got a sort of outline of what I want to say, and then I just go and talk around that. But for the TED talk, like, you got like 12 minutes, so it's got to be tight. And so that was really different, right? So if you're trying to do something that's really succinct, I think it's like Mark Twain who's credited to, like, I would have written a shorter letter, but I didn't have time. That's kind of what I think about, when writing a kind of speech that you're giving. Like, if I've got a chunk of time, I can extemporaneously just sort of talk about the key ideas. But again, if you've got like a short elevator speech that you're trying to do, that takes a different approach. You have to really hone those messages. You've got to shave down and cut out the excess. And then I do practice those kinds of things. But really, I prefer just, my mother would be so ashamed, but I prefer to kind of wing it sometimes.
Yeah, I remember a previous guest that I had, and he makes fun of me for the fact that I practice quite a bit of my presentations, and he likes to wing it. But you definitely can see the difference, and you certainly can't eliminate the fat when you're winging it, because it's coming out as you say it. So it is what it is at that point, and hopefully it makes sense the way it comes out. If
Well,
you
I'm
were
sorry he made fun of you, because he shouldn't have, right? Like, everyone has their own process. For me, I've been public speaking for, let's see, I turn 40 next week. And so I've been public speaking for, 3/4 of my life, right? And I have built up a sort of confidence and efficacy and skill around that. Not everyone has that. And so everybody has their process, and whatever is your process, honor that, and don't feel shame just because you may do it differently than somebody else.
No question. So if you were to offer someone one tip on getting better or more effective at giving presentations, what would it be?
I think practicing, right? Practicing is really key. And so, I think, and I don't necessarily mean like practicing at your desk, right? But the more presentations that you give, the more confident that you're going to be able to give different kinds of presentations. I would also advise people to be really, if you're doing slides or something like that, really learn. I had a mentor, she's a retired senior vice president from TI, and she told me this 20 years ago. She's like, if you can't give your presentation without slides, you're not ready to give that presentation. And so don't be so dependent on your slides. Your slides should complement your narrative. They should not be the anchor of your narrative, right? And so, I go to so many different conferences where academics and students just like read their freaking slides, and I'm like, no, folks, like, tell a story. Stand up there and talk about what you've done, and think about the kinds of people that you like to listen to. They tell rich stories. So even if you're presenting technical work or you're presenting any kind of research, you can still talk about the story in it, right? And think about how you like to hear whoever told you stories growing up. Learn to have inflection, learn to use pauses. You want to try to captivate an audience, and you want to have them really wanting to listen to you. And so I think that the more that you practice that, it's going to be really useful. I will also say that public speaking, and just, I mean, I even think of when I lead workshops is, speaking, but like, it's acting. So when I'm teaching a workshop, I'm putting on a show. It is my job to both teach and entertain you. Because if I'm so boring that you want to log off, I'm not doing my job. So it takes a lot to like, especially virtually, because you've got to be really animated and you've got to like engage people and you got to kind of draw them in. And so everybody has their style, but you think about like, I'm putting on a performance for a minute, right? And I want to engage people in this. And so if that sort of helps you think like, I'm going to put on my like actor hat for a little bit and then I'm going to take it off and like decompress, then that's fine. But again, think about how do I sort of perform this thing, perform this story, whatever it is, to begin to help people want to listen. But again, practice, 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 and seek feedback. I've been really fortunate that I've had lots of people who've offered me feedback over the years, and that helps me grow. Um, and so, you can go to things like the different speakers groups where people actively give you feedback, or you can just ask your colleagues when you present, hey, could you just notice a few things that I can improve on? Don't ask everybody on the same day because it will really beat down your self-efficacy. And maybe ask like one person a week, like, hey, can you just pay attention to my presentation and offer me any kind of specific feedback that might be able to help me improve, and then work on that.
Okay, well, practice, don't depend on slides, tell a story, teach and entertain, feedback. There's a number of tips there, people. So hopefully you're able to take one. You're able to take one. No, that was great. This has been an excellent conversation, Meagan. Thanks for being a guest. How can people get in touch with you?
Well, Neil, thank you so much for the opportunity. You can find my website, engineerinclusion.com. I've got tons of free resources that you can access to learn about how to intentionally engineer inclusion. The TED Talk I did a year ago on inclusive leadership, I've got lots of great resources that you can download on that. That's what I'm really focusing my efforts on right now. Find me on LinkedIn. I'd love to connect with you there. I don't tweet or Insta as much as I probably should, but my personal website's meaganpollock.com, meaganpollock.com, but I'm mostly focused on engineerinclusion.com right now. And I would love to connect with your listeners. So let's connect and learn from each other.
Excellent. Well, everyone, that marks the end of another edition of Teach the Geek interviews. My name is Neil Thompson, founder of Teach the Geek. It's an online platform for science and engineering professionals. You can learn more about it at teachthegeek.com. Again, that's teachthegeek.com. Until next time, take care and stay safe. Thank you, Meagan.
Thanks, Neil.